We're going to start off talking about who came up with the idea of evolution in this section, and that is Charles Darwin. Most of people, know, if they know anybody from biology, they know Charles Darwin. And he did journey around the world, we'll look at that, and form this idea of his with evolution that he turned into the theory of evolution. Now, you're going to be working on your chapter 1 homework, and one of those things that I ask you to look at in that chapter is what is a theory versus a hypothesis. And a theory, you'll find or remember, is a very, very well supported idea or set of ideas related to a natural phenomenon. And this theory of evolution was put forth about 150 years ago, and to this day we have only found evidence that continues to support the theory of evolution. So what was the idea before Darwin? So before Darwin put forth the theory of evolution, most people believed that species had been created separately and were unchanging. So they were all created at the same time, created individually, and hadn't changed over that time period. There was an idea that the Earth was only about 6,000 years old, and that these individuals had been created at the same time. However, when Darwin got into the sciences, there were several individuals who had already started to change these ideas. And so we're going to take a look at the scientists who had started to make those changes and influence Darwin as far as his ideas on the natural world. So the first one I've got here in the red box. So all of these scientists that you see here are influences, but I'm going to go in a little more detail on the other guys that are on the page. So this gentleman over here, who is Buffon, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the rest of his name, but Buffon, as you can see, was around in the 1700s, and Buffon was one of the first scientists to suggest that the Earth was older than that 6,000, 10,000 year old range that we had. He actually set the age of the Earth at 75,000 years old based on his calculations. He was a little bit off. We know today that the Earth is around 4.6 billion years old, but his 75,000 year old estimate gave more time for things to occur, which helped as far as looking at the other things that were going on that other scientists discovered. So let's take a look at the next individual who's here. You can't see his full name. It's Cuvier. So I've got slides for the other scientists. So Georges Cuvier, he was the main scientist who found that species had to change. This is because he was exploring different areas that had fossil remains. And his fossils turned out to create these sorts of individuals. So giant ground sloths, Irish elk, which you can see stood at head height of about 6 feet, and then mastodons. These are animals that didn't exist, don't exist today, didn't exist in Cuvier's time in the 1790s. And this indicated that species had to change because that meant extinction happened. And so this started to get people to think that some things needed to change. Because if things went extinct, that meant things had to be changing. So Cuvier said, nope, things had to change because things were going extinct. The next scientist that influenced Darwin was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was in the early 1800s, and he could have been Darwin, except for how he was explaining the mechanism for this. So he also was giving the same idea that Darwin, what we'll talk about, is that species are changing over time, that living species are changing over time, as you can see here. However, Lamarck was talking about that the changes were coming about from the use or disuse or not using different features in an individual organism's lifetime. So, for example, you can see here, this is what's called Lamarck's giraffe, as you can see, that you have a short-necked giraffe ancestor, and that giraffe continues to stretch during its lifetime to get leaves higher and higher and higher until you get a longer neck, and then that giraffe will give birth to a long-necked offspring. Obviously, we know this isn't how it works, and that was part of the problem, is that he couldn't show that this is actually what was going on. I mean, the idea here is the same thing, would be the same idea as if we had a bodybuilder who would be having a child and the baby would come out looking like a bodybuilder, all muscly. Okay? We know that's not the case. So the problem for Lamarck was the mechanism on how he thought this was occurring. But he had the right idea that species were changing over time. The last scientist in that list was Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell was a geologist, and he wrote the 1830 book Principles on Geology. Parts of this book are still used today in modern texts. And the idea is that there is gradual but constant change shaping the planet. So geological forces were shaping the Earth, things like, mountain producing forces, valleys, cliffs were created by, the pushing of different forces on the planet. Now, at the time, they did not have plate tectonic theory, if you've heard of that, which is the shifting of the plates on the planet, creating things like mountains and so forth, but it was the same sort of ideas, as well as weathering, so the wearing down of rocks. So Darwin had this book and actually had these ideas that this change was occurring, and also that the different layers of rock on the planet were a record of time. And so big influence as far as what he saw when he went out into the different areas around the world. So as far as Darwin himself, he actually tried a couple of different things before he ended up studying science. So he actually started off in medical studies. However, he did not have a good time as far as the medical studies there at the University of Edinburgh. Attended his first surgery. If you think about surgery at the time of Darwin, those 1800s, surgery was brutal, no anesthesia. Decided, nope, not for me. So his father urged him to go into the ministry, and so he studied at Cambridge to study theology, but he actually, while he was there at Cambridge, studied nature, studied science, looked at the specimens and so forth, and when it came up that there was a ship's naturalist and captain's companion, which is basically he took meals and had conversations with the captain on the HMS Beagle. He applied and took the job. So he took that 5-year trip around the world on the HMS Beagle. So here is the trip. So they started in London, headed south, made several stops in South America, and that included the Galapagos Islands just off of the coast of South America. then made their way around to the islands of New Zealand, made a couple of stops in Australia, some of the islands in the Indian Ocean, a stop in Africa, and then on their way back up to London. So they did this travel. This was not necessarily always a great time for Darwin. The HMS Beagle was a 90-foot sailboat. So it was fairly cramped, lots of time at sea, but he did get to pursue his love of nature at every single one of these stops. When they got off, his job was to go out and collect specimens of plants and animals and fossils, pack them up, and have them shipped back to London on other ships. He took tons of notes, sketches, and all kinds of things to take back with him or send back, so that he could, basically create these observations when he got back. So, what did he see? Well, one of the things that he did see was similarities and differences with fossils and living plants and animals in the different locations he was at. So he was again studying Lyell's Principles of Geology because he read it constantly on his trip and understood this idea of these patterns as far as age in the rocks, but was finding these fossils in the rocks that looked a lot like local organisms. And a lot of people know Darwin's work for the Galapagos Islands. So here's a shot of the Galapagos Islands. These islands are very unique because they have a huge amount of different habitats. So you can see there's some forested areas, there are some desert areas, there are mountain areas, and so a wide variety of different habitats. They are volcanic, so very harsh environments as well. And so one of the groups of organisms that he studied were the finches. That's what people know him most for. But he also studied other organisms here, like the lizards and the giant tortoises. So let's take a look at the two big patterns that he found that he didn't expect to find. So the first one is the one that most people have heard about, and that is the finches. So traits exhibited by species is the idea here. And so with the finches, it's the idea that he found, in the case of the finches, mainland finches, which he collected from South America. So there are finches found in Ecuador, which is about 600 miles from the Galapagos. And so he had samples of these sent back to a colleague in London, as well as samples of the finches that he collected on the islands. And Darwin thought they were actually all the same species, just different variations, kind of like humans are different variations, right? We're short, tall, brown hair, different skin colors, things like that. And he figured it was the same sort of thing. But his colleague figured out that no, they are actually different species. And you may be able to figure out why if you take a look at the pictures. So what is it that is different about these birds? So yeah, the beaks are what the difference is. So you can see that the mainland finch has one that's very much in the middle of all of the rest of them. But ground finches have these huge beaks versus tree finches versus warbler finches. And you can see warbler finches have a very small pointy beak. And these are just 3 of the many different finch species that are found there. There's even one that's called a vampire finch, which has an even differently adapted beak. And turns out that these traits are tied to where they're found on the islands and the food that they're eating on the islands. This is not the only trait exhibited by a species that he found. He also found this with things like tortoises. So tortoises had different shell shapes and neck lengths depending on where they were found and what they were eating. Okay. So that's one. The other one is similarities between fossils of extinct species found in an area and the living species in the same area. So an example of that you can see here in this picture between the glyptodont, which we actually had those here in North America as well, and the hairy armadillo. So the glyptodont, this guy was the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, if you get that kind of picture in your mind. You can see he was 10 feet long as far as the height goes, so he was a little longer than a Volkswagen Beetle, but the body of him was about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. So the height was about the size. So he had this big armored shell on his back with the tail and so forth, but very similar in structure to the hairy armadillo. The hairy armadillo has that same sort of armor on its back, tail, similar structure for the head, forelegs, and so on. And this guy is found in South America today. Same thing here in North America. We have armadillo species in North America, and we also used to have glyptodonts. And so he found this not just with these guys, but with lots of different plant and animal species, where he would find an extinct version that was very different in size or shape, but very similar as well, and had a matching living version on that same region.